Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology that we do in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I'm joined by two colleagues, one co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity of this program, La Sierra Connections way back, Archaeology Connections way back, an associate director of the center as well. Kent Bramlett is also an associate director. He's also a newly minted chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology, and is basically our main professor of archaeology at La Sierra, both undergraduate and graduate. And then we chime in and do different sorts of things.
We're the has-been, he's the future.
Yes, that's right.
Following in the footsteps. Some great examples here. You're doing so much to develop the program and its reputation and some of the other programs on campus.
You know, it's really fun to watch because the academics that you are most responsible for, but also the lab, you're the curator of the lab, the programs that are happening at the center. This is a huge team effort, and so it's good to be part of it. It is extremely rewarding to be part of it.
It is. We're privileged to have such a wonderful collection that illustrates so much of what we do that connects to the Bible.
And supporters who help this center run.
Right.
Lots of people in the audience that watch this program, so we're very grateful for them as well. We have been walking our way through the Old Testament, archaeology of the Bible, book by book, and we turn our attention to a book in the 7th century BC. We decided to do the prophets by century rather than the canonical order, because then the setting, the context that archaeology contributes to is consistent. We don't have to keep jumping back and forth. And so now we turn our attention to the book of Zepahniah. Was that a popular book for you as you were growing up or in your studies?
I can't recall spending a lot of time in Zepahniah. But you know, it's classic prophetic work. It's short, but it has all of those components that one expects.
And we'll see that in the outline, the various components that prophetic books typically convey. Right.
So I like it. I think it's a prophetic book in a nutshell.
Especially reading it as compared to reading Jeremiah or something like that,
Right.
where it's so many things, and they're not orderly. They're not in an orderly fashion. In fact, we will be turning to Jeremiah soon and be thinking about that. But Zepahniah, it's crisp, it's concise, kind of carries the components. So you didn't kind of grow up?
No, Zepahniah was not on my horizon to begin with. When you read through the Bible, you, of course, include Zepahniah, but before you have too much time to think about it, it's gone. So it seems more of the same, frankly. Yeah.
Well, we have lots to think about, and as we have entered into the 7th century BC, thought about Nahum in our last episode. Transitions from the 8th to the 7th, let's think about those again for just a minute, because we're talking about people and prophets who are living in an extremely dangerous time. And maybe that's what makes these words mean something more, maybe meant more to them than it does to us as we read it. So what's happening in these transitions that we're now caught in the 7th century?
Well, the Egyptian power is faltering. I mean, it had been, but it's in, 663, that Thebes, the capital, falls. And that's used as
an illustration in Nahum, for sure.
It is, yeah.
So rare, isn't it, that people went clear down into Egypt who were foreigners and overcame them or fought with them. The Egyptians were used to thinking of being pretty protected where they were. But so that was disconcerting, I'm sure, for them. The whole world was topsy-turvy right now.
There'd always been that tendency to lean on Egypt from Jerusalem's standpoint. And then, of course, the Assyrians are still very powerful. There'll be a new power on the horizon, Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Medes are on the horizon as well, although that's they pick up with the Persians a little bit later. So there's these shifts going on, and Zepahniah falls in this very tumultuous period. What will happen to Judah? Is the question.
So would he
wondering.
have had an audience if there was so much turmoil? Does a prophet have a greater audience in times of turmoil as opposed to times of peace?
I think so. When people are worried, they're on the lookout for some good news, for some hopeful news, for somebody who can interpret what's going on for them so that they can feel more secure.
Do you suspect that they looked forward to listening to a prophet? I mean, prophets often preach doom. Was this something they would turn to quickly? Or because things were so hard and difficult and challenging, maybe that is kind of the last place you turn, but you need a prophet. You need somebody to interpret what's going on.
And most of the prophets didn't mind whether they had people who cared much about them or not. They felt just called to speak and to interpret. And so whether people listened or not, or whether they cared about them or not, they felt that they had to do what God compelled them to do.
We have some artifacts on the table, several that we haven't seen, at least recently, on the program. And so, Kent, I want you to start and talk to us about the jewelry and so on that is there, because the prophet talks about attire, especially foreign attire and jewelry. So what do we have here?
Well, at this time, certainly as most times, attire defines the person. And, they didn't change, styles didn't change that quickly. You were what you wore, and that signified who you were. So, of course, items of adornment helped present who you were. And the more valuables you could wear, especially the women, it showed they were from a high-status family, household. And it was just a part of life, if you could afford it. Here we have a couple of necklaces made from precious materials, especially this one. You have the blue of the lapis and the green of the turquoise family of stones. And then you have some probably bracelets. And over here, a signet ring. That's another type of adornment, which was extremely important because the official or individual wearing it would use that signet ring to stamp documents, and it would authorize them as.
And Isaiah actually comes out and mentions them in a list of things that are in terms of judgment that's coming, can be problematic, but.
So it's just an assortment that illustrates some of what Zepahniah is talking about.
And then I think you have some lamps there in front of you. Is there a transition in these lamps that would kind of help us date things a little more precisely? Is that something? Are there changes that take place?
Well, there is. The lamps are becoming more closed over time. And actually it'll come to a point where they start making them in two halves, so you have a top and a bottom, and then they're completely enclosed. But you have something of a progression from very open form here, becoming more closed to where it's very pinched off and flat here. And so it's a snapshot in time, really, of this larger development.
So with these, the end one, are the last one you came to, 7th century?
7th century.
Or is that
from the
getting
600s.
even a little bit later? Okay.
Well, 600s into the early 500s.
Okay. And then it's earlier from those.
A little bit earlier.
And then there's a tablet there. Larry, I'm going to have you start here, okay? But you can't say one more thing about the tent.
Well, the Assyrians were great archivists. In fact, Ashurbanipal had a great library in Nineveh, and actually is proud of the fact that he can read. He tells us that. So apparently, a lot of the kings couldn't read themselves, but it was something of a novelty, certainly something he was proud of that he could. And he collected documents from around the world, the Assyrian world, of course.
20 to 30,000.
1,000 documents, all of the best. He took them or his scribes copied them.
Right.
But he had this huge collection, which burned and was preserved, and archaeologists later found it.
How would you make that tablet and use it? Describe that for us.
Well, it is a lump of clay, slightly rounded, which makes it easier to inscribe with a stylus, which is simply a reed that's sharpened into a V shape. So they would create these cuneiform or wedge-shaped signs by putting the end of the stylus in and then tipping it slightly to make a line extending from the triangle. And there were hundreds of these signs that they had to learn because they're, many of them represent whole words. We call them logograms. Some of them represented syllables, consonants and vowels. And together you had this huge corpus of signs that scribes would learn. I mean, there's some job security in that, I guess. It's not a simple alphabet of 20-some letters. It's hundreds of signs you have to learn.
We will try to see some slides from Ashurbanipal's library. That connection is important, certainly for this time period. You know, when Ashurbanipal is pulling all of these texts together, creating this library. This has led Kent, Larry, I don't know if you knew this, to look at our site at Ameri in Jordan, kind of a backwaters site in many ways, to look for the library at Ameri. We'll see. We haven't found that yet, but we'll keep looking.
Some wishful thinking, I believe. If only.
We have to admit that very few places in Palestine have libraries that have been found. We find them in Egypt, and we find them in Assyria, Babylon, Persia, but tablets got sent sometimes to Palestine, so you find one or two here and there. But that would be very exciting if we found a library.
Larry, what do you have?
Yeah, these two black juglets are probably for some expensive kind of perfume or ointment or something like that, because they're small and narrow opening. We've got several of them in our collection and very characteristic of this particular time. And here we have some pillar figurines, and lying down over here are some that are very characteristic that come from this period and a little farther north sometimes. Here's a beautiful little vessel that has a lid. Perhaps, is this stone, is this alabaster?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like an alabaster, which typically often comes from Egypt, but they're trading all around the Mediterranean world, and so it's very easy to find those elsewhere.
Perhaps part of adornment that may have been for cosmetics.
Right, right.
And if we're talking about attire, especially foreign attire, and adornment, then that would certainly play a role. In part of it. And then ceramic vessels over here, a couple of cooking pots, kind of standard shape, some of Kent's favorite vessels, and a jar here, as well as a very nice bowl. Some of our nicer vessels from around this time. I'm assuming, Kent, that we've got some fluidity here between the vessels over time.
Yeah, we do, and that's actually a very important point. You know, potters didn't all die at once, and the next generation started a new style. So in some areas, you actually have older styles being made in later times. Other areas are more avant-garde, and they're developing the new styles. They're coming on sooner. So you have to be somewhat aware of that as we think about stylistic changes. And we can place them into a best fit.
Yeah.
If Zepahniah were to walk in on us talking, he'd feel right at home with these things on the table.
I think so. I think so.
He might have a problem with some of these figurines.
That's true.
He has quite a bit to say about worship, but yes, he would certainly.
Well, and now that you
recognize
mention that, see, these figurines appear by the hundreds in Jerusalem. Do they appear after the 7th century? Do we have numbers of them after the Babylonian captivity?
Yeah, the pillar figurines like we have here do.
They stick around for a while.
So what does that mean?
Right. Well, and that comes back to this interpretation question. Were they good luck charms? Were they votive gifts that you gave to the deity as you were making your offerings? Are they deities? Are they goddesses? So a number of options here.
People today, even who use images, sometimes call them aids to worship. They would deny that they worship the object itself, but it helps set the mood. So we don't know whether that was true back in ancient times. Could have been.
Well, we'll have some things to think about. These are part of Zepahniah's world. And then we want to look at Zepahniah's book, an outline here. Not long, not a long book as we've already talked about it. What seems to be fairly standard about this organization of the book?
You look both at what's right around you as well as what lies somewhat distant. It's back and forth sometimes.
You have that.
And notice the progression too. You have the judgment against against Judah and Jerusalem. Then you have judgment against the four nations, but it ends with this message of hope.
Mm-hmm. Right. In fact, a lot of people would argue that this is relatively standard for the way the prophets laid out their materials. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, we should remember that they did not just write books, they made speeches.
Right.
And
Other
these
people wrote
speeches
them down.
then were collected and typically put into an order like this one. Judgment against Judah, oracles against foreign nations, which were kind of the beginning of hope because these people had oppressed us, so God is going to bring justice around. The second introduction of oracles against Jerusalem is kind of out of the pattern because typically it moves then from oracles against foreign nations to the oracles of salvation. And there's this movement. It's fairly standard for the prophets to start out with something fairly strong, fairly judgmental, move through the speeches against foreign nations, a transition to hope, and then come out with these salvation.
Motivational. I mean, it's a good approach.
Well,
What's
they were
going to happen
preachers.
without hope?
Right.
Why change?
Right. And they were preachers. That's what they were. That's what they're, I mean, that's a great way to describe it.
Spokespersons for God.
And in the process, speaking for God, putting it into categories of speech and literature that made sense in their world, which may be a reason why they're kind of hard for some of us to read through them. They are not our categories.
No.
And so we have to work harder at reading some of the prophetic books. But it's worth it. It's worth it. Kent, what do we have here with chronological context?
Well, it's a nice diagram showing a sequence of kings, and Josiah being the principal one of the 7th century that we read about in the Bible. Manasseh had a very long reign earlier in that century. But during Josiah's reign, or contemporary with him, we have then at the box on the right side the list of prophets who were active. And it's remarkable, and carried on a little bit into Jehoiakim's reign with Jeremiah, but it's remarkable that we have, again, this sort of bursting forth of prophetic voice at this time. Again, times of transition, times of difficulty are when people look the most for some sort of message.
I wonder how much Manasseh's rule, he never passes muster. None of the biblical writers feel that he has done justice to leadership or to religion. Would he have repressed prophetic voices in such a way that we don't have anybody from that time? Would that have been another factor?
Well, we certainly have that somewhat oblique reference to Manasseh sawing Isaiah asunder. And tradition says in a log, and then they cut the log in half. Yeah. So
maybe there were some times when
Dangerous time to be a prophet. So.
that could have been most any time, but sometimes we're better, especially maybe when the audience was paying attention and was more interested. So we look at the geopolitics too, and these are the same for some of the other prophets we'll see, but let's just do so quickly. Here, Judah marked out. And I think I've heard you say, Kent, that part of these boundaries can be determined by the seal impressions that Hezekiah used, the Lamelech seals on jars, and where they're located, and where they're from, and so on. And then if we turn to the Assyrian Empire, covering a large area from the Persian Gulf all the way over to the Nile. And Kent, you've talked about the shifting capitals. Now, why does that happen? Why does one king come and say, I really don't want to stay here in this capital, I want to move to another place?
Well, the Assyrian kings seem to want to create this legacy. And so the founding of new capitals is one way to show your strength and your power. You create this huge, I mean, there were 600, hundreds of acres in size. And this is on a scale completely different from, say, Jerusalem.
Right.
It's just vast. And they left legacy, new palaces, Khorsabad, Kala, Nineveh, All these sites were Assyrian capitals for a while.
And toward the end, the Haran, is that what we have?
Well, they never built it up as a capital, but yeah, as they're being pushed by the Babylonians and losing territory, they retract into their Western Empire, and they set up at least the military garrison at Haran, or Haran.
Now it does show up a lot in the texts, Haran does. And that may be because of that activity that's going on, the battles and so on that are happening. And then if we shift to the Babylonian Empire, similar coverage, a different style of leadership, a different military strategy. It doesn't mean that they were less fearsome, but the Assyrians certainly seem to have held first position when it comes to frightening and scaring the opponents and preparing them for submission to them. But in any case, now a different set of rulers. And going into the end of the Babylonian kingdom toward the end of the 6th century. So we're actually moving toward the kind of the last half of the 8th, last half of the 7th, last half of the 6th century for some of these major events. Right. So general history, we'll not take time to think about the specifics here. We have some artifacts we want to look at, but we always have to ask the question when it comes to archaeology, what can these finds tell us about and help and fill in gaps for the history of the time? That's something we do on a regular basis. We do have some artifacts, and we're going to look at some of them. Some Baal statues, and these are here because of references in the book of Zepahniah. That's why we have put them here, so they're connected. Foreign attire we'll talk about, and we'll talk about why that was a problem and why that was an issue. And hoards. If you didn't have the stock exchange, or if you didn't have a good bank, where would you keep your wealth? Well, we'll take a look.
Put it in a jar and bury it in the floor.
There you go.
Especially in troubled times. You know, people hide hoards hoping for a better day, and then sometimes they get forgotten or people get killed, and archaeologists get to find them.
That may be another reason why archaeologists have this sort of perverse delight in destruction.
Right.
People hurt, but you find lots of things that otherwise simply wouldn't have happened. So. Okay, what are these?
Typical statues of Baal.
Lots of examples, aren't there?
Lead god.
And it's interesting, he's always shown in the striding posture, one foot in front of the other, with smiting. One hand is raised, probably holding an implement or like
maybe a mace or something?
A mace, exactly. And the other hand would hold typically the thunderbolt. So he's the storm god. Think of thunder and lightning in his hands.
Right. Now, Kent, I think, well, I'm going to go back to Larry because I think you were helping us as we were beginning. Because I don't think the Baal statue that we found at Ameri, I don't think you were, I think that was before you came to Ameri. So what did we find at Ameri?
Well, we found the lower part of, the legs of a statue. But I would say they're relatively rare, and yet a number of them are known because Baal was the lead, most important god throughout much of this time.
And this was in a household context.
Right.
Foreign attire. Okay, so these slides are simply illustrative. Foreign attire comes up in Zepahniah because the elites were dressing with foreign attire, and that tended evidently to lead them astray. And so Zepahniah comes down fairly hard on foreign attire, and so these are just examples, some from Egypt, some from other places.
It's like old-time Christians today being upset that people don't look like they used to when they went to church, that these people today are wearing jewelry and they're wearing fashionable things that we weren't used to back in the old days.
Maybe in a kind of a standard church setting where the traditional community has to make some serious adjustments when people coming with either with musical instruments that they're not used to or clothing. And it seems to be that clothing in church has changed a lot, even since you and I were young. So maybe something like this would happen. I wonder if there were any religious connotations tied to foreign attire. I wonder if that was part of it.
There were, because they saw people who worshipped differently from them dress that way, and so in their minds they connected that kind of dress with that kind of worship and those kinds of gods.
And maybe the jewelry was connected in a similar
Also,
way. So perhaps that's why we have something so strong here. I have a couple more pictures. Now this one is supposed to represent Semitic people. Where does this come from, and what does it say?
It's from a tomb in Egypt that's found along the Nile. But the dark-skinned individuals are locals wearing linens, and the lighter-skinned people are the Semites, as you mentioned, and they're wearing cotton and wool kinds of, I don't know about cotton, but wool, certainly. And they may be miners, you know, people who've been out mining and coming into town.
So maybe we have here a separation of the clothing so you don't get it mixed up.
Right, right.
Kind of the opposite of what Zepahniah talks about. Okay, this is from, what, 2.5 millennia before. I just like them. And these are
Their
from...
clothes are definitely different.
They are different. And I suspect if somebody in Judah, of course this is too early for Judah, but we're wearing something like this, people would know, okay, we're talking about something from Mesopotamia. And then the jewelry. Lots of different kinds of jewelry. These from Josephine Verducci, our specialist on our excavation, who has documented all kinds of jewelry, including these bracelets and bangles, and you showed us, I think, a couple on the table, Kent. Beads, you've also showed us some of those. Earrings, lots of different kinds of things, including tasseled earrings. What? Or something to hold loose clothing together? Is that
I think so.
what we've got? And maybe the same with these, what, kind of clothespins sorts of things. And now hoards. So we've got archaeologically collections that have been found. And we don't have the vessel in which this was found. But this was a collection that probably, well, may have been put there because somebody was fearful. And so you put it in the ground. Some of these others we'll see. This one is actually from a later time period, but has a lot of golden jewelry in it. This one back to our time period, or at least close. Is the pottery fairly close to 7th century?
It does look.
And so, and then we have this must have been one of the jars with the strainer. So that was used for making beer, typically, at least according to the people who study these things. So reuse of a jar in a new context and to keep things. And here from Tel Dor along the coast. So what do you do when you have something that you need to keep?
Put it in a jar. Nobody will know it's there.
No interest accruing.
Right.
But at least it should be there, right? So a number of things that come from the book of Zepahniah, illustrating the book. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope that this has provided something for you to think about, something to help you on your faith journey, and we do look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.